Now we come to the part of the session where I briefly sketch main events of those 145 years we're looking at here. And first we have to look at the political revolutions that created responsive government in Britain, the United States and France, which were the Glorious Revolution in the late 1600s in Britain, and then the American and the French Revolution in the late 1700s. And we have to be careful not to speak of democracy in a present day sense here, because big parts of the population were disenfranchised on terms of gender, on terms of race, on terms of property. However, the transition from absolute monarchy to democracy began in these times. And this, of course, also had a strong impact on the political economy, because those who were enfranchised first into responsive government are mainly the economically stronger parts of the population. So there is some strong relation between government and business beginning at this time, and only later were the mass of the population also enfranchised into democracy, which then again changed the dynamic somewhat. Secondly, we have to look at the Industrial Revolution, so the first Industrial Revolution beginning in Britain in the late 1700s and stretching out to the mid-1800s. And here Great Britain was in the lead, and what we saw there was a major transformation in the way production took place. So there was a lot of more mechanization, automation. Steam power was very important. So manual labor, where products were produced by individuals producing their individual product, this became less and less important. Instead, there was more and more machinery involved in the production process, and this first happened in the textile production, then also steel production. And what was really important here was steam power as a source of power for production. And Britain had the lead, and then France, other European states, the United States, and later Japan followed the British lead. What we had very briefly in the international political landscape in the 1800s is what we call the Pax Britannica. O'Brien and Williams argue that this is a little bit of a bold claim, because of course the British did not control the world in the way that the Romans controlled their empire. However, the British were the dominant naval power, and thereby they were able to enforce a certain kind of international regime, and they were also able to create a certain balance of power on the European continent, avoiding major great power war in this time. What we also see, and which kind of directly follows from the beginning of capitalism that I already talked about, and from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, is the rise of the workers' movement. So we had not only that workers began to mobilize as a movement, it's also workers first of all emerged at all, because before there were factories, there of course were no factory workers. So this class was formed at this very time, and they began to become politically active and organized themselves, which later on had a strong impact on world history. When we look at colonialism, we see two big developments. On the one hand, we see the formal decolonization of the Americas, and this does not only apply to the United States, which probably everyone in this class knows, but also to most of the Latin American nations, which also gained their independence in the early 1800s mostly. But this was of course only the formal independence. This did by no means mean that all Latin American countries were equal counterparts to their former colonizers or to the United States. This was still a very asymmetric relation for the most part. What we have on the other hand in colonialism was the territorial expansion of European empires in Africa in particular, but also in large parts of Asia. And this is the episode in colonialism that we would then term imperialism. Then we have what we call the Second Industrial Revolution taking place in the second half of the 1800s. And the Second Industrial Revolution was not focused on the textile industry, but now we also have the chemical industry and other heavy industries gaining ground. And this second revolution was no longer driven by steam power, but was now driven by electric power. And now the geographic focus of industrialization also shifted from Britain to Germany and to the United States of America. And this also, of course, had to do with Germany finally becoming one nation state in Europe, because until 1871 there was no such thing as Germany really, and now it was formed, and then it around the same time became a major industrial power, and then of course also a major military and political power with all the consequences this had. One of these consequences arguably was World War I. World War I, of course, wreaked havoc on European nations where it was fought. It also had major consequences on the international political economy. I want to name two here at first. One is a change in trade patterns, because, of course, those countries that fought as enemies in the war did not engage in much trade mutually. Secondly, it also transformed production internally, focusing production on war production and on war-relevant industries. After World War I, of course, came the interwar years, and there we have a lot of things happening politically, economically, socially. We had, towards the end of World War I, the Russian Revolution and the rise of Soviet-style communism. We had big transformations in politics in Germany and many other countries. We had first attempts to build big international organizations. But here I want to focus on one thing, which is the Great Depression. And a depression is something different than a recession. What we are witnessing right now, hopefully, is only a recession. And a recession means that economic activities decline for a certain period because there's an economic crisis, and then the recession will be over and economic activities will resume. And you see this, for example, in what we call the Great Recession in 2009. In 1929, however, we saw a Great Depression, which means that after the economic activities declined, they remain on a very low level. So production remained on a low level, trade remained on a low level, employment remained on a low level, and this, of course, has very stark consequences economically, socially, and politically. One thing I want to add here is that this depression was probably due to the fact that this economic crisis was not handled very well by the governments, because they did not do what governments should do to kickstart the economy. Rather, they engage in policies that worsened the crisis. You could excuse this to some extent because Keynesian economics and this kind of macroeconomics, where you think about what governments have to do to kickstart an economy after a crisis, it did not really exist back then. So you can, to some degree, excuse the governments for doing what they did by saying they didn't know any better, but they could have known some better. After that came the Second World War, and the Second World War was, by all measures, much more horrible than the First World War already was. I'm not going to go into any detail here. What I'm just going to say is that the Second World War ended the period where Britain and other European countries kind of dominated the world. It almost came to an end after World War I, but then it was somewhat re-established this order because the United States were not willing to take this big place in the international system. But after World War II, Europe became not irrelevant, but it stopped being the center of the world, because now we had a bipolar world split between the United States on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other hand, and Europe was kind of split up between those two empires, and this marked a drastic shift, of course. Now finally, what was new in this time? In politics, we had a lot of innovations in this time. We had the rise of the liberal state, so a state that only enforces a law. We have the rise of the nation state, which is somewhat different from the territorial state that we mentioned last session, by now being amended by the notion that we have a nation with everyone being part of this bigger entity. Then we have a rise of anti-colonialism, first in the Americas, but also in other parts of the world. We have an incremental rise of democracy. Again, we should not see the political orders we had back then as full-blown democracies, but we had a development towards liberal democracy as we have it today. We see a certain rise of international organizations, particularly after World War I. We see the rise of socialism and the rise of fascism, so a lot was going on back then. When we look at international trade, we can see an explosion of international trade as compared to the period before, and it was mainly, of course, still the trade of raw materials from the colonies and of industrial goods from the metropoles, so from Europe and then also from the United States and Japan. If we look at how production is organized, first we have what I talked about at the beginning of the session. We had the beginning of capitalism, what is sometimes called the capital takeoff. And speaking of what we were talking about last session, this is also one of the big riddles in political economy or in social sciences. Why did capitalism happen in England in this time, and why did it not happen in Italy 400 years earlier, or in China at some other part of time, or in ancient Rome? This is one of the big questions. There are a lot of explanations, but I'm not going to go into that. And coming with capitalism, we also had the two industrial revolutions that I just mentioned. This also transformed labor. On one side, we see a massive expansion of industrial labor, which did not really exist before, and now we have a lot of people working in factories at the end of this period. On the other side, we see an abolition of formal slavery, mainly in the Americas. Unfortunately, this does not mean that the former slaves were then free and equal human beings vis-a-vis their compatriots. Rather, many of the slaves had to work under very similar conditions as they did before. When it comes to finance, we also had major innovations. For most of this period, we had the gold standard, about which I'm going to talk a little bit more next week. We also had a massive expansion in international investments, which means that investors, mainly from Europe and the United States, invested their money in mainly colonies, or then former colonies, to make a profit there. And this, of course, had effects for both sides. We also have a major expansion of the stock markets, so more and more businesses were now using this way to finance themselves. So now we do have financial markets. This then also affected business organization. So I mentioned in the last session that the British and Dutch East India companies were probably the first corporations in the modern sense, and over this period of time the number of corporations and their relevance to the overall economy expanded. So at the beginning of capitalism we still had a lot of family businesses, and now the focus was shifting more towards a concentration of capital in these big corporations. When we look at the military, we now finally come to a time when the European nations were able to overwhelm most of the others, except for the United States possibly. Now we have all those modern weapons that the others did not have. So we have gunboats, which were very important to enforce colonial rule in Asia in particular, but also in Africa. We have machine guns, which at first only the Europeans and the Americans had. We had tanks, and at the end of this period we had the nuclear bomb, and this enabled the Europeans to enforce this kind of territorial domination in Africa and in Asia, which they weren't able to enforce beforehand. And at the end, it also enabled the Japanese to conquer a lot of Asia in the Second World War. When we look at gender relations, we see quite different and even contradictory developments. So at the beginning of industrialization, factory work was mainly work for women and children, because men weren't willing to do so, and the children and women could be forced or encouraged to work in factories. Later on, as factory work became more established, more accepted, and maybe even more attractive, it became a man's job, and women were rather forced out of the factories. What we saw then was the emergence of the male breadwinner family model. The idea then is that we have a man who works, and by working earns enough money to pay all the expenses for himself, for his wife, and for their children. And this is the kind of family model that nowadays we might think of as the traditional model, but it actually wasn't there all along. It's the traditional model of late industrialization. What we also have at this time is the emergence of the women's movements. This already started in the late 1800s in France and Britain in particular, but it really gained speed over the course of the 19th century, and particularly in the early 20th century. And at the end of this time period we're looking at here, in most Western industrial societies we have universal suffrage, meaning that at least women are allowed to work. This does of course not mean we have achieved full equality. We didn't have in 1945. Now we might be a little bit better, but we're still not at full equality. But a lot happened when it comes to gender relations in these times and when it comes to feminism. When we look at the realm of culture and ideas, also a lot happened, and most of the ideas that I name here relate to political changes that I mentioned earlier. So we have the emergence of liberalism, of democracy, of nationalism, and anti-colonialism also typically as a form of nationalism. We have the emergence of feminism and also of socialism as an idea. What I don't have here is fascism, because fascism isn't that much of an idea actually. The last innovation I want to talk about today is of course Scrooge McDuck earning his famous dime number 1 in 1877, which allowed him to become a not so good capitalist. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks for staying with me till the end. See you next week. I'm looking forward to your questions. Goodbye.